Good afternoon. I'm back from spending spring break with my folks and my brother's family in Tennessee. It was good to be with my dad as my mom began transitioning to a memory care nursing home. On Monday, Sarah and the kids and I sat in our backyard to experience the total solar eclipse. Even with the cloudy sky, we watched darkness fall in the middle of the day. It was like God dimmed all the lights. Songbirds stopped their calls and bullfrogs started croaking and got noticeably chillier. Travis said, "This is just like when Jesus died on the cross." Only the sunlight failed then for 3 hours, not just a few minutes. We watched what looked like a sunrise in the west, and then all the lights came back up. We didn't see the corona, but little while later, the clouds thinned a little bit, and I caught a few glimpses of the partial eclipse. What an amazing experience. This week, in our 1 year chronological Bible reading, we finished the book of Judges and read through the book of Ruth. Now we're starting 1 Samuel. As I mentioned last week, Judges describes what happened as the Israelites settled into the Promised Land. They didn't drive out all of the Canaanites as they were supposed to. Instead, they started intermarrying with them and adopting their practices of immorality and worshiping other gods. Whenever they did so, God let them experience the consequences of their actions. They were harassed and oppressed by their neighbors. When the Israelites came to their senses, they cried out to God, and He delivered them with judges. These judges were not courtroom judges, but military heroes who defeated Israel's enemies and ushered in a time of peace. As long as the judge lived, the people obeyed God. But when he or she died, the people fell into idolatry and sin again. The cycle gradually spiraled out of control. Even the judges got progressively worse. The book highlights 6 judges and shows their increasing corruption. They started off fairly well, with Othniel and Ehud and Deborah, who delivered their people, but became increasingly worse. Gideon, who tested God, Jephthah, and Samson. Gideon, put out a fleece to test whether God would actually do what he said he was going to do. He punished his own people, and he eventually made an idol that his people worshipped. Jephthah made a rash vow, promising that he would slaughter whatever first came out of his house when he came home. He ended up sacrificing his own daughter. Samson was promiscuous, violent, and arrogant. Each of these judges were filled with the Spirit of God, which enabled them to deliver their people, but that does not mean that God condoned their sinful actions. The book of Judges shows Israel's tragic downward spiral. It's a sobering examination of the human condition that highlights our need for a deliverer. The book ends with 2 very disturbing stories that show how incredibly lawless the people had become. A private army raided a temple and burned a village to the ground. Sexual abuse and violence led to civil war. The final verse of the book said, "In those days Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes." The only hope for Israel was a king who could unite the people and bring them out of their cycle of corruption. That story begins in the books of First and Second Samuel. In between Judges and the accounts of Samuel comes the book of Ruth. The Bible Project describes the book of Ruth as a beautifully crafted look at how God's good purpose interplays with human decision. It's a tale of love, loss, faithfulness, and redemption. God used a faithful non-Israelite to bring restoration to his people. Picking up in the days when the judges ruled, the book of Ruth tells the story of Naomi, the Moabite widow Ruth, and the farmer Boaz. Naomi and her family went to Moab during a time of famine. Her sons married Moabite women, but they and their father died in Moab. Naomi counseled her daughters in law to go back home to their families, to find new husbands for themselves. But Ruth showed loyalty to Naomi. They went back to Bethlehem together. In need of food, Ruth gleaned barley from the field of a man named Boaz. He turned out to be Naomi's kinsman redeemer, who could marry a widow in order to preserve the family line and property. Naomi and Ruth hatched a plan to get Boaz to notice Ruth. One night on the threshing floor, Ruth asked Boaz to redeem the family and marry her. Boaz recognized Ruth's noble character and agreed. Ruth and Naomi celebrated. Boaz mirrored Ruth's act of loyalty by marrying Ruth in the presence of the city elders. Their marriage produced joy and the birth of a son. The book ends with a genealogy showing how this Moabite widow became the great-grandmother of King David. Curiously, God is hardly mentioned in the book of Ruth. At a time when people looked for God to be active through a judge or a king, God instead worked out his will through the everyday faithfulness of people. This faithfulness benefited not only Naomi and her family, but went on to bless the world through the family of David, the line from which the Messiah, Jesus, would come. 1 Samuel begins with the story of Hannah, Samuel's mother. There are a lot of connections in her story with the stories of Abraham and Sarah, as well as Jacob and his wives. Hannah was unable to bear children, so her husband's other wife ridiculed her. Hannah prayed at the tabernacle in Shiloh for a son. When God answered that prayer, she dedicated Samuel. Her prayer of praise when she left Samuel in care of the priest foreshadows the prayer of Mary when she was pregnant with Jesus. As Samuel was serving at a young age with Eli the priest, the Lord called to him at night. Samuel thought that Eli was calling him, but after 3 times, Eli realized it was the Lord calling and told Samuel to reply, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." God gave Samuel a warning for Eli about his corrupt sons, which eventually came true. Samuel became a prophet, and God let none of his words fall to the ground. There's an interesting story in chapters 6 and 7 of 1 Samuel about a time when the Philistines captured the Ark of God. They brought it back to the temple of their god Dagon. But the next morning, the statue of Dagon had fallen over in front of the Ark of God. They set Dagon's statue back up, but the next morning it had fallen over again, and its hands and its head had broken off. God afflicted the Philistines with tumors and infertility. So the Philistines moved the ark from place to place until they decided to send it back to the Israelites. Near the end of Samuel's life, when the people were clamoring for a king, God warned the people that by rejecting him and asking for a king, they would be subjecting themselves to the whims of their new leader. The king would take the best of their land and crops for himself. He would take their sons for his armies and their daughters for his serving girls. But the people insisted that they wanted a king so that they could be like the other nations and have a strong leader. So God sent Samuel to anoint Saul, a man who stood head and shoulders above all the other Israelites. Saul began well as a king, winning many battles against Israel's enemies. But later this week, we'll hear how Saul's pride and rebellion against God brought about his downfall and the rise of David. Hope to see you this Sunday for worship at 8:30 and 11 with Sunday school and our adult class on the book of Genesis at 9:45. Have a great week.